Federalism and pluralism are basically the same thing, except with pluralism, the groups do not have to be geographically based. I would like to make the case that pluralism is the new federalism. And of course, on this channel, I'm trying to make analogies between the old Enlightenment, where the scientific revolution happened, where the US Constitution was born, that time period, some of the changes in knowledge production and legitimacy and governance and economics, some of those translate into some of the revolutions that are happening today. And I think there are a lot of really good comparisons there. And of course, federalism was one of the main tools that the writers of the US Constitution used in order to create checks and balances on power, protection from tyranny of the majority. Some of the important goals that those founders had were implemented through federalism. And of course, by federalism, we're talking about the balance of power between the states and the federal government, such that the states had a lot of power to self-govern. And yet, the states also had to cooperate with each other to create a federal government. So that was way back then. Now, what is pluralism, and why do I think this is a good analogy here? So pluralism, there's a great article by Glenn Weil sort of explaining what he means by pluralism and relating it to some of these values, which I will link to. But the basic idea is that when you talk about governance, instead of just one person, one vote being the main way the governance is structured, you recognize the importance of groups. And in particular, groups who could potentially self-govern because they have the cohesion to do that or the will to do that or whatever, where you want to actually reserve some of the rights of those groups to self-govern within themselves, and yet they still have to cooperate with the whole. So in a lot of ways, the analogy here is that federalism and pluralism are basically the same thing, except with pluralism, the groups do not have to be geographically based. And of course, that's kind of attractive because I think most of us recognize right now that the geographic groups of our states are not necessarily a cohesive group that we feel is really representative of us as people, in the same way that they were back then. Like if we do think about the 13 colonies, at that time, there was way more religious cohesion within a single colony. There was way more cohesion in terms of industry. There was cohesion in terms of sort of the community that you spent your time with and that you had values that were similar to. Your geographical community was probably a good proxy of a lot of the things that were your community goals and personal goals. So it made sense to have states have this power back then. Now, of course, what do I mean by groups? Like if we're not talking about a geographic group, what kind of group might we be talking about? And so I think this is flexible. And of course, the best kinds of groups are going to be groups that people self-select into based on their trust in that community. And this could be trust in the leaders, it could be trust in just the people in that community, it could be trust in the governance structure that that community has decided to take on. So there's lots of different structures that could work for this. And technically, geographical communities are communities that you opt into. But we all know there's other factors that are playing a role in that kind of decision. So this is really about trust. Now, how would admission into any one of these groups get determined? And I think there's going to be a lot of different setups that could work. Like it could be up to the group to decide who gets into that group. So maybe for some of these, anyone who wants to join could join. For others, you might have to agree to certain rules before you join. I could imagine groups where you have to prove that you belong to a particular profession, like nurses or legal scholars. I could imagine groups that are religious groups where you have to agree to certain doctrine before joining. And in some ways, the whole project of trying to get pluralism to work in practice is really going to be focused a lot on how you determine groups, what are they allowed to do to constitute membership, all of that. That's a big complex part of what pluralism is, I think. Now, at this point, if you're like, whoa, wait a second, you could see a lot of ways where this could go wrong if you try to govern the country in this way. And I feel the same way. On one hand, if we're trying to just implement this pluralism thing on top of the existing system, as if it's just like the existing system. Yeah, I don't think that would work. But if we're talking about governing online spaces and coming up with creative ways of governing professions and, economic activity and, online social media algorithms or whatever, if we're talking about governance in these other spaces, I think that could be a really good place to experiment with pluralism per se. Okay, but if you still have this reaction where, wait a second, this isn't going to work if we have some type of group that's not geographically based. Hold on for a second, and I want to give you an example at the end that might open your mind. Now, let's just further the analogy a little bit. So when the designers of the Constitution came up with that design, they knew that this was a tricky balance and that there would be conflicts between states. They knew that it was not an easy thing to implement. And so there was incentives to cooperate across states. And incentives for cooperation, I think, are going to be a key part of this, that you don't want to create a system that incentivizes constant warring between tribes, but rather you want a system where the self-governance within a group is something that develops genuine consensus, genuine trust in the leaders of that group, but where you're also incentivized for groups to cooperate across difference, to work together to accomplish mutual goals. You want the structure of the system to really think carefully about how these incentives are borne out. The key here with pluralism is that each of these groups gets recognized in an official way by the bigger entity, which would be the federal government if we're talking about, the founding of the US Constitution. But this could be a social media site, it could be online economic marketplaces, it could be the ethical foundation of the field of law, the lawyers and legal field. There's so many different realms where this kind of thing could be experimented with, and different incentive structures could be played around with. Now, I promised that I would give an example that might open your mind to the possibility of pluralism being implemented. And my example here is going to relate to online spaces where deliberation on public policy issues is happening. So basically, social media spaces. One of the complaints that people often have is that people in power will speak on behalf of particular groups. And in a lot of ways, this is how people in power maintain their legitimacy. They say, I speak for low-income people, or I speak for certain disadvantaged groups, and therefore that's why you should empower me. And sometimes people in these groups sort of look at that and they're like, nope, they don't really understand what's going on here. They don't get us. The things they're saying to sort of represent what our group believes are actually kind of either wrong or maybe just emphasize the wrong things, or maybe the people in power are sort of lifting up the people from their group that are convenient to lift up. I mean, that's a problem. So the question is, could there be spaces where people from a particular group self-govern about the way they want their views recognized? Now, this doesn't mean you have to censor everybody who says, oh no, that's a wrong view of their group. It just means we're adding an additional piece of information where this particular group comes together and develops some kind of self-governance to put out an official range of viewpoints within that group, or perhaps an official set of speakers or commentators that say 30% of our group really appreciates what this commentator is saying, you're going to get a more accurate view of that group's views if you have something that's sort of pluralistically governed. And I will probably do another video just on this topic, this idea. And when I do, I'll post the link so that you can hear this idea fleshed out a little bit more.